You had to make the switch because instrumentals bands were not going to survive, really. People, they've got all these entertainers out in front of them, the ones we've just talked about, and people wanted to see somebody up there performing and singing. I remember watching the Beatles. I remember being over at Neil's place with his mother watching Ned Sullivan. They were playing the Beatles, and we were just spellbound with this band. And then, if I remember right, that's around the time that Neil showed up one day at practice and said, we're going to do some vocals. And I think one of our earlier vehicles were Beatles songs.
The first two vocals Neil did in the canteen at school were Money and It Won't Be Long. And I think it's interesting that when he chose those two, it was quite a shock that he did that in front of his fellow students, and it didn't go down well, despite the fact it was the Beatles. There were shouts of "stick to the instrumentals" from his fellow pupils. Again, a firm indicator that Young at this point, and some would say thereafter, was never a great vocalist in the traditional sense.
Through the door after the Beatles came the Rolling Stones and the Animals and just dozens of bands from England, you know, with all kinds of different styles. And you know, there was that sense of this tremendous infusion of energy from England. You know, you even get an instrumental band like the Shadows, who weren't huge here, but you know, you would read about them in magazines and you would get the records and you would think, you know, what is that? You know, and Neil Young just, you know, he loved the Beatles, he loved the Rolling Stones, he loved the Shadows, you know, he drew on all of it.
I mean, when the Beatles and the Stones and the so-called British invasion first happens, Neil still isn't a songwriter. He's still very much a guitar nerd, although he has this wide range of musical interests. And, you know, I think initially he probably focused on George Harrison rather than Lennon and McCartney. I hear the influence of George Harrison on Neil Young. You know, you listen to a song like When You Dance I Can Really Love on After the Gold Rush, and you know, to me that is very Harrison-esque. And I remember when I was 16, 17 years old listening to After the Gold Rush and George Harrison's All Things Must Pass that had come out round about the same time, and finding all kinds of parallels between them. Like a mountain that's growing, a river that flows, let me come over, I know you know, when you dance, ooh, I can really love. So, you know, possibly George Harrison was a greater influence on Neil Young's music than Lennon and McCartney was. Similarly, with the Rolling Stones, I think his first identification was not with Mick Jagger, because Mick Jagger didn't play an instrument and Neil Young wasn't a singer. He identified with Keith Richards and with Brian Jones, and he loved that sort of notion of the two guitars. I am the little red rooster, baby, too lazy to crow for day.
The Rolling Stones, a major part of the British invasion, were viewed in many ways as the antithesis of the Beatles, due to their menacing and subversive undertones, and this would prove a major attraction for Neil Young.
It's interesting that he gravitates to not the Tin Pan Alley pop songs, but the kind of darker stuff. You know, that's possibly there in Roy Orbison. It's certainly there in the Rolling Stones.
If you're looking for direct parallels between Neil Young's music and a big British act's music, there are probably more, I think, between Neil Young and the Rolling Stones. I think maybe the more aggressive tone of the Rolling Stones suited Neil Young's most rock-oriented compositions more than the Beatles did, or maybe another British group like, say, the Zombies would have.
The kind of sense of danger that the Rolling Stones represented, I think Neil Young felt that. You know, the Stones seemed scary back then. Also, I think Neil Young loved a lot of the music that the Stones drew on. I think, you know, he heard a lot of, you know, what Motown was, and he heard a lot of what Stax was. He heard all that R&B stuff, you know, as the Stones did, and they made it part of their music. Now, you don't necessarily think of Neil Young as, you know, a kind of funk or R&B guy, but he loved that stuff. He loved Booker T in the MGs. You know, he played with them many times. You know, so that kind of sense of understanding what the Stones' sources were, and I think really taking a kind of pleasure in that, and you know, also getting that rock and roll element of it, you know, the kind of sexiness and the scariness of what they were.
The Rolling Stones' influence would find its way into many aspects of Neil's music, including his work with Crazy Horse, and most notably at the beginning, with Buffalo Springfield track, Mr. Soul.
You don't have to be a musicologist to realise that Mr. Soul is pretty much a rewrite of Satisfaction, you know. I can't get no satisfaction. Well, hello, Mr. Soul, I dropped by to pick up. They're not a million miles apart. Although I know Neil is on record as saying that he thinks Get Off of My Cloud is a much better single than Satisfaction, but possibly he just said that to throw everyone off the scent of the fact that he'd ripped off Satisfaction for Mr. Soul.
Oh, hello, Mr. Soul, I dropped by to pick up a reason for the thought that I caught that my head is the event of the season. Wine crowds, just a trace of my face could seem so pleasing.
Although Get Off My Cloud is clearly not as good a song as Satisfaction, there is something that he liked about it which ties in with several of the motifs of Neil Young's career. He once said that the reason he loved Get Off My Cloud was because it sounded like they didn't have a song and Mick and Keith had written it on the way to the studio. And I think he found this spontaneity enormously attractive. You know, this does recur throughout his career, where, you know, the things that are sort of the best laid plans, he's made a bit of a habit of tearing them up and going off, you know, on a whim, on a sort of spontaneous, spur of the moment thing. And you know, he always felt that was a vital spark in pop music.
The Stones continue to be an influence in subtle ways. I mean, obviously in his general R&B, rock and roll songs, you know, they're a key influence there. But they turn up unexpectedly in other areas too. On Tonight's the Night, the roughest of all his roughest albums, I suppose, that has a real Stones earthiness, I suppose, that comes from via Crazy Horse, and the whole album been fueled by tequila and late night sessions. But amid there is a song called Borrowed Tune, which is basically a melody borrowed almost wholesale from Lady Jane. Wonderfully enough, he admits it in the lyric, you know, where he says, I'm singing this borrowed tune I took from the Rolling Stones, alone in this empty room, too wasted to write my own. The actual admission of plagiarism. And against the Stones, I often was perplexed how he got away with that.
I'm singing this borrowed tune I took from the Rolling Stones.
The dichotomy in Young's work was between, by say 1969-70, was when he was invited to join Crosby, Stills and Nash, and it became Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. I mean, they were the American Beatles in a sense, the second generation lot. They kind of had all the talents of the Beatles in terms of, you know, songwriting, vocals, instrumental ability, the ultimate supergroup. On the other hand, you had Crazy Horse, who were kind of more like a bar band, rough and ready, terribly patronised by David Crosby, who didn't think they could even play. But Neil Young managed to have careers with both of them simultaneously, and he wouldn't abandon Crazy Horse. And, you know, the attitude was, why are you still playing with those guys? You know, can they even play? But the earthiness of them appealed to Young, and he always used to compare them to the Stones, in a sense. And he said, yeah, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young are the Beatles for me, Crazy Horse are the Stones for me. But he always had the telling punchline, you know, I always did prefer the Rolling Stones as a group, and I preferred them to the Beatles.
How many roads must a man walk down?
Another major influence that runs throughout Neil Young's work is that of folk. Folk music saw a revival during the early to mid-1960s, running parallel with the energetic and engaging sounds of the British invasion.
One of the major cultural reasons, for the resurgence of the folk movement in the United States in the early 60s was civil rights. There was a sense in which, this was music that had been banned in many ways. Someone like Pete Seeger was unable to perform on television and unable to perform in many, venues. Then suddenly, he went around the country, played wherever he could, and that was part of kind of seeding a movement. At a time when John Kennedy became president in the early 60s, this sense of young idealism, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. This sense of a kind of youthquake that was artistic and cultural as much as it was political.
Because the initial excitement of rock and roll had kind of subsided, for people who were in their late teens or entering college who wanted to do creative music, they found folk music maybe a more attractive model in a lot of ways than rock music was. Instead of becoming a teen idol, which for some people like Dylan really would not have been possible, he didn't have the teen idol voice or the look, I think that going back into folk music, it's a roots music that in some ways is similar to the rhythm and blues and country and western that inspired rock music. And it was something that was quite easy to do in the sense that you could often do it alone on a guitar or just playing with a small group with a duo like Ian and Sylvia, one of Neil Young's Canadian folk inspirations.
I am a man of constant sorrow. I've seen trouble all of my days.
Toronto was an important folk scene, and Canada was an important folk scene, in the early 60s. There was obviously artists, like Neil Young and like Joni Mitchell and like Leonard Cohen and like Ian and Sylvia, were all around there. Toronto was one of the stops on the folk itinerary. You'd go to New York, you'd go to Boston, and you'd go to Toronto. That sense in which everybody's kind of drawing on influences and learning songs from each other. There was a kind of communality there.
What's fascinating about Toronto at that point is that there were two different areas in the town that were devoted to two different types of music. On the one hand, you had the folk music in the coffee houses, of which there were plenty of them. And then on Yonge Street, you'd have the bars. Ronnie Hawkins was playing there, Ronnie and the Hawks. This is for the drinkers, and they wanted rock and roll, R&B, the kind of stuff that Young would later play with Crazy Horse or whatever. Probably would have fitted in quite well there. And on the other hand, he was an acoustic player for the coffee house crowd, doing kind of what increasingly became Dylan imitations. And so here we have the twin Neil Young in a sense. Neil Young the rocker, Neil Young the folkie, and they're coexisting together.
I think Ian and Sylvia are maybe among the more overlooked major influences on Neil Young. We know they're an influence because they're named along with a lot of other people on the back sleeve of Buffalo Springfield Again, Buffalo Springfield's second album, where there's a big thanks to. It was very unusual for that time, and a lot of influences, some of them very obvious like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, but some of them not so obvious were listed. Ian and Sylvia were there. I think it would have had to have been Neil Young.